Well, welcome everyone to the 2022 installment of the Global Black Studies webinar series. This installation is for Latin American, Hispanic American, or Chicano American Heritage Month, depending on your preference of verbiage. The title of this presentation today is Remixing Reggaetón, the Cultural Politics of Race in Puerto Rico. And it's a conversation with Dr. Petra R. Rivera-Rideau, Associate Professor of American Studies at Wellesley College. This webinar, hosted by the Global Black Studies program at Western Carolina University, is co-sponsored by Equal Opportunity and Diversity Programs and Intercultural Affairs. And for WCU students, this is a Degree Plus program. And before I begin any webinar, I always take time to thank and acknowledge the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, of whose land us as faculty, staff, and students are guests. And we thank and acknowledge them. And thank you for joining us today. And I first want to do a brief, very, very brief definition of what reggaeton is for our listeners who may not know. Reggaeton is a music style from Puerto Rico that was influenced by reggae en español in Panama, hip hop, dancehall, bamba, and plena. It has evolved from dancehall and has been influenced by American hip hop, Latin American, and Caribbean music. Vocals include rapping and singing, typically in Spanish. Reggaeton is regarded as one of the most popular music genres in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, in countries including Puerto Rico, Panama, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Colombia, and Venezuela. Over the 2010s, the genre has seen increased popularity across Latin America, as well as acceptance within mainstream Western music. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Petra, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. I'm excited.
The pleasure is mine, the pleasure is mine. And we usually do a conversational format for our new attendees to our webinar series. So we won't be doing formal presentations and PowerPoint slides and any of that stuff. This is an attempt to take our academic knowledge and research out of the ivory tower and make it accessible to the general public. So just letting everyone know, and without further ado, we'll begin. And I'll begin by posing this question, because the title of this webinar is actually from your book. And what made you conduct the research that you conducted?
Oh, that's such a great question. I love that question. So I have a PhD in African diaspora studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And I was very interested in race in Puerto Rico, where my parents are from. And, you know, Puerto Rico is, of course, a colony of the United States. So the United States obtains Puerto Rico at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And since then, Puerto Rico has had this colonial relationship with the US. But in terms of race relations, it's much more similar to other places in Latin America than it is in the United States. And in the book, I talk about these ideas about mestizaje, or racial democracy, that are very common in different parts of Latin America, like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. And in Puerto Rico, the way this ideology works is this idea that Puerto Ricans are mixed with Spanish, African, and indigenous Taino ancestry, and that this race mixture has produced a more racially tolerant population. So as opposed to the United States, which is marked by like Jim Crow and, legal segregation, the logic is that Puerto Rico has avoided this kind of racism because of race mixture. um, one result of that is that it can be difficult to tackle questions of anti-Black racism in a place where the sort of um, dominant narrative is that it doesn't exist. So I went to Puerto Rico with an idea of studying popular music as a site where people have theorized their experiences as Black Puerto Ricans, and also as a site where a lot of people debate questions around race. Um, and I picked reggaeton because at the time that I was doing my research, so I started graduate school in 2004, and that's the year that Daddy Yankee's song Gasolina came out in the United States. And so I liked reggaeton. I liked listening to it. I believe that as researchers, we should research things that we like or that we're passionate about. So I like it, but I at that time there was very little research about reggaeton available, and I went to Puerto Rico with the idea of studying bomba, which is an Afro-Puerto Rican folkloric music. But what I found when I was hanging around these bomba musicians is that a lot of the kind of discussion about race was happening in relation to people's conversations about reggaeton, right? Because reggaeton um, is a kind of music that in the Puerto Rican context emerges in working class, predominantly Black communities, right? And so it becomes a place where people talk a lot about race and Blackness and its intersections with Puerto Ricanness. And so I think that combination of experiences, of listening to people talk, um, of it being an entryway to get people to think about and talk about race in a place where people don't do that very much, or where that wasn't so much part of the conversation at that time. Combined with the fact that I liked it, made a good place to, like, a good entry point into thinking about Puerto Rican racial politics.
Indeed, indeed. So how do people engage with the issue of race in reggaeton, or uh how did you discover that they were
Mm.
that
Yeah,
was
that's another really good question, because I think the situation now, almost 20 years later, is very different than the situation when I did my research, which was different still from when reggaeton began, right? So a lot of people in the United States think of gasolina, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Even if you don't think you're familiar with it, you've probably heard it somewhere. Um, so a lot of people think of gasolina as the sort of start of reggaeton, but actually reggaeton has a long history that precedes gasolina. So I think it's really important to think about when the question of how people talk about race in reggaeton, uh, changes over time, right? So right now, probably many people, there are many think pieces, many podcasts about the popularity of reggaeton right now, with particularly the ascent of Bad Bunny, who is one of the most popular global music stars, not just reggaeton stars, right? People are probably familiar with him. He, sold out a stadium tour in the United States. It's a huge deal. He's often praised for his political stances. Um, and but he has received a lot of criticism for being sort of tepid about racial politics, right? Um, and he has been used along with other current stars like J Balvin and Maluma from Colombia, um, as an example of the whitening of the genre. So having white Latinx people sort of be the face of a genre that was originated with poor, often Black Puerto Ricans. It's not an old story, right? Like in US pop music, we had this story with rock and roll. We've had this story with many genres, right, in the Americas. So I think one of the things that's very interesting to me about our current moment is what that shows is that people are paying attention to the racial politics of this genre over time, right? If and that I think is a different conversation than people were even having 10 years ago on a sort of mainstream Latin music level, right? So in terms of the historical ways people have thought about race in reggaeton, as I mentioned, reggaeton is and you said this in your definition, right? Um, Reggaeton can be very difficult to like pinpoint exactly where its origins are because it has so many different musical influences. Dancehall in Jamaica, reggae in Espanol, which is a genre of music in Panama in which the descendants of West Indian Panamanian laborers who live in Panama take dance hall tracks and rap over them in the dancehall style in Spanish or sometimes in Spanish and English, right? Um, so you've got that. You've got hip hop in the United States, right? Which Puerto Ricans are very familiar with because Puerto Ricans played a critical role in the development of hip hop in the US, but also because um, the US, Puerto Ricans have been US citizens since 1917. And so that allows a lot of back and forth, right, from the island. And so people are bringing hip hop back and forth. So there's all these influences kind of circulating. And one result of that is that there's even debate about where reggaeton even came from. Did it come from Panama? Some people say it started in Panama. In my book, I talk about Puerto Rico as a place that where Puerto Rican youth, and similar to hip hop, it was a lot about the DJ, right? So like if you think about hip hop's origins, the DJ would be the person that you wanted to see, and then the MCs would all be like around the DJ. So that was true with reggaeton as well. And so the DJs would bring together all of these influences and kind of piece together what I think are some of the kind of key musical elements that we hear in reggaeton. Um, like I said, that's sort of controversial because there are some people that say this happened in Panama. There are some people who say this happened in New York, right? So it's not like a settled question. But I think one thing that people do agree about is that it was really African diasporic Black identified populations who were doing this. So the reggae en Espanol singers, like I said, are West Indian, descendants of West Indian laborers who were living in the Canal Zone and who identified as unambiguously Black, right? And who had an experience with anti-Black racism and came from communities that had a long history of organizing. And I want to give like a quick shout out to my colleague, Keisha Corinaldi, who just literally like last week or really recently just published this fabulous book called Panama in Black, which is about the history of West Indian Black organizing, which calls Afro-Caribbean organizing in the Canal Zone. So if you want to know more about that, you should look up Panama in Black. It's really good. So, and then in Puerto Rico, there are these like working class communities, right, that have a substantial Black population. And those are the communities that are developing this music, right? And so I think even though the question of origins can be sort of messy or conflicted, which is a really common issue in Latin music and really in pop music studies in general, right? But I think there's an agreement that there was this African diasporic orientation, right? And a consciousness about anti-Black racism that was informing the music. Now, most of the music thematically, like the lyrics are about parties, they're about girls, right? They're not like profound political lyrics at the time. But in the book, I talk about things like aesthetics, right? Meaning like fashion or hair. I talk about things like, even the monikers of some of these early artists. One of the most famous DJs credited with developing a lot of reggaeton is named DJ Negro, which means Black in Spanish, right? So, I mean, that it was a kind of an embrace of a Black identity, and a Black identity that was tied to an experience of marginalization, of living in urban areas. Because I think one of the things that also makes this a bit complex and different from the United States in terms of Puerto Rican racial politics is that, as I said, Puerto Rico's ideology is this like we're mixed. Black, European, Indigenous. So that means there are some ideas about Blackness that are compatible with the Puerto Rican nation, right? But those ideas about Blackness tend to be very folkloric. They tend to be these sort of romanticized images of plantation life under slavery, right? Puerto Rico had slavery until 1873, so after the United States emancipates. After emancipation in the United States, Puerto Rico still is a slave society, right? And so that's very different image than the kind of urban, um, often imagined to be male, right? Uh, person with braids and baggy pants listening to reggae and hip hop, right? And that image of Blackness is not necessarily understood to be compatible with Puerto Ricanness, right?
Mhm.
So in my book, I have a chapter that talks about the development of reggaeton in that, with that in mind, right? That this wasn't just about socioeconomic class. So in Puerto Rico, like in many places in Latin America, a lot of questions about race and racial inequality are understood to be issues of socioeconomic class, as if class and race were not like intimately linked together.
Indeed.
And so, in the book, I say, like, yeah, there is this question of socioeconomic class, but there are also these discourses about race and Blackness that are tied to place, like urban housing developments that my colleague cited, and Z Flores done a lot of research about kind of segregation and public housing in Puerto Rico, which is really excellent. Um, it's about class, it's about place, it's about race too. So when I think some people who are reggaeton fans may have, there's an artist named Nicky Jam who just won this like icon award at the Billboard Music Awards, which kind of makes me feel really old. But so Nicky Jam is somebody who, like, right now he's like known for these sort of like romantic songs, but he was a pioneer in reggaeton with Daddy Yankee early on in the mid 90s. And he talks about in his acceptance speech that when he sees the ascent of someone like Bad Bunny, he feels proud that this genre of music has risen to this kind of level, because his experience, he talks about, he was knocking on doors, right? People weren't taking this music seriously. They thought it was, uncouth, unrefined, too sexual, too violent, right? And associated with a lot of stereotypes of urban Black communities that were negative, right? And another interesting fact that comes out of this is Daddy Yankee, who's arguably, everyone's very invested in Bad Bunny right now. He is important, but there would be no Bad Bunny if there hadn't been a Daddy Yankee before. But Daddy Yankee owns all of his masters, which is really unusual for a lot of artists. And the big reason he does is because when he started, record companies did not want to sign him because they thought this wasn't great music. And so, he eventually gets distribution deals with major record conglomerates, but he owns all of his masters, right? So that just gives you an idea of, like, the industry wasn't really invested in this in terms of the music industry. The Puerto Rican government was not very into this. There were several censorship campaigns trying to stop it. And it sort of persisted over time in this kind of organic way to like become this thing, right? So I don't know if that really answers your question, but
No, it
the
does.
idea is that, right, it was like this stigmatized working class Black thing that then becomes more popular. And like a lot of US pop music, right, as it becomes more popular, it starts to look more and more white, right, and more quote unquote respectable. And so that's sort of where we are now. There's a lot of I'm pleased at the conversation people are having, questioning why there are so many white Latinx artists kind of dominating this scene. Because I think that points to some really important racial dynamics in the Latin music industry that have been allowed to be sort of swept under the rug for a long time.
Indeed, indeed. And you preemptively addressed my next question, so I don't have to ask it, but I'll just state it so the audience would know. Because I did some research on the criticisms of
Mhm.
reggaeton, right? And they were mentioning misogyny, violence, gangsterism. Even some criticisms were talking about the narco culture, narcotics culture. And then they mentioned, and you mentioned the artist, that in response came out with what they called the romantic style in English, right? More, I guess, family friendly
Mhm.
messages or consumable messages. Now, and it leads me to think about I have an 8-year-old daughter, so if I keep looking away, it's because she demands attention and I got to make sure she's all right. So I've been watching, and I have custody of her. So I've been watching a lot of Disney stuff that I never would have watched before. And I'm seeing a lot of hip hop and also reggaeton. And I recognize some of the styles and some of the sonic sounds, and I'm like, man, normally people over this sound would be saying things totally not appropriate for kids and things of that nature. And it's just the mainstreaming of things as well as the whitening in many ways. Now, dovetailing with this, I guess, new attention to what many people would call Afro Latinx or Afro Latino identity in places like Brazil and Costa Rica and others, even since, we both have a background in African American or African diasporic or African studies. Black studies is what I call it, but we have background in that. And the movements in those places to even have Black studies institutionalized in their educational systems, how or if it has impacted the conversation or, involving uh, the whitening, for lack of a better way to put it, of reggaeton in the context of these broader structures and conversations.
So you mean like the how has the sort of how has Black studies kind of
Or
contributed
this,
to the discussion of Afro-Latinidad? Is that sort of, or Afro-Latinx identity?
I guess, yeah, that would be a good place that we can start. Yes.
I think that's a really good question. And so I think there's a couple of different things, right? So first, the educational system in Latin America is quite different, right? And so there are places in Latin America, universities in Latin America that are implementing Black Studies-esque programs or Black Studies programs, but it's a sort of a slow going thing, right? Um, in the United States, of course, we've had Black Studies programs, right? Um, since the San Francisco State. But
Yeah.
we've also, one of the things I like to convey to my students is, Black people, Latinx people of color have been writing about their experiences forever, right?
That's
And the
right.
same is true for Afro Latinx people, right? So Afro Latinx people have um, been theorizing their experiences for a really long time, even though I think in the US Academy, people haven't been paying that much attention to them until recently.
Mhm.
Of course, the most famous one would be Arthur Schomburg, right? If you're in Black studies, hopefully you know Arthur Schomburg, right? The bibliophile who collects this huge archive of the African diaspora that becomes the basis of the Schomburg Center in New York City. You know, Arthur Schomburg, he anglicized his name. He was Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, and he was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico in the 1870s. And then he moves to New York um, to be, as part of this kind of cohort of Cuban and Puerto Rican independence activists,
Yes.
right,
Yes.
from Spain. And so all of that to say Afro-Latinx people have this long history. But I think one of the things that has happened in when I did my graduate work at UC Berkeley, for some reason, there was this cohort of graduate students who were very interested in race in Latin America and Black communities, Afro-Latinx communities. And some of them have become major leaders in our field, like Tiana Paschel, who does work on Colombian and Brazilian social movements, Jomaira Figueroa, who looks at Afro-Latinx um, literature and also literature of people from Equatorial Guinea, which is the only Spanish-speaking country in continental Africa.
Mhm.
Jennifer Jones, who's done a lot of work about Afro-Mexican immigration to North Carolina, right? We were all in graduate school together. And what's sort of weird about that was that we didn't have any faculty at the time who studied race in Latin America. We just sort of found each other and happened to be at Cal at this moment. And I mentioned that because the institutionalization, I think, of different ethnic studies type programs like Black studies or Latinx studies have been imagined as very discrete entities, right?
Mhm.
So Latinx studies has been a field, as a field that emerges, especially on the West Coast around the Chicano movement, right? And the Chicano movement, sort of analogous to the Black Power movement, right,
Yes.
is really centers mestizo identity and mestizaje, this combination of being Spanish and indigenous. And the Chicano movement does a lot of ideological work to recuperate and celebrate indigenous roots, right? Which is really important. However, Latinx studies has also, until relatively recently, really embraced this mestizo thing. And so Afro-Latinx studies, when I was in graduate school, was not popular. Like we were at 8 in the morning at all the panels, all of our panels, nobody would show up. Latinx studies programs were not hiring Afro-Latinx studies specialists at that time. Like now there's many jobs, right? On the flip side, Black studies programs were very US centric often, or maybe US and continental Africa, but often not incorporating Latin America, except maybe Brazil or Cuba, right? And certainly not incorporating Afro-Latinx in the US material at that time. And so the same sort of biases within like the Latinx communities and Black communities that like created this kind of invisibility of Afro-Latinx people, I think got replicated in the academy, in the university. And now we're seeing a real shift. If you look at an academia, like one of the ways we look at like a trend in a field is hires, right?
Yes.
What kinds of topics do universities want to hire experts in? And you see a growth of jobs. I mean, there's never like millions of jobs, right, in Black studies or Latinx studies, but there's an investment now on the parts of universities to talk about Afro-Latinx studies that's super different than when I was a graduate student.
Yes.
And I think that's really important. And I think it helps us think about different ways of thinking about Blackness and how anti-Black racism functions, right? So another really great scholar I will plug is Tania Cateria Hernandez, who's actually a legal scholar at Fordham. And she just wrote a book called Racial Innocence. She's written several books about customary law and the different ways that legal structures in Latin America have marginalized and, Black communities there, right? But this is a book about kind of legal structures in the United States and how that's promoted kind of the invisibility of Afro-Latinx people, and also a book about anti-Black racism in Latinx communities.
Yeah.
It's really excellent, right? That kind of work, right? Tania Cateria Hernandez has been doing this work for a really long time in law schools, but I think that the kind of buzz around those kinds of books has made a big difference in our field. And one of the things that Hernandez talks about in her sort of larger body of work is that, in the United States, we've talked about like this shift, like this post-Obama shift to colorblindness. And now we don't have racism anymore because we had a Black president, right?
Yes. Yes.
Hernandez has written in the past that we could look to places like Puerto Rico or Brazil as to see what's coming down the line, because they've embraced this. They don't call it color blindness, but they've embraced this ideology that we are a country that does not have racism, while simultaneously maintaining systemic anti-Black racism. So she said, like, we need to pay attention to what's happening in Latin America in order to understand what's starting to happen here. And I think that's a really kind of, so in terms of sort of like how these academic disciplines like have impacted the study of Afro-Latinidad, I think also the study of Afro-Latinidad or Afro-Latinx experiences and theories are really expanding our notions of Blackness and our notions of Latinidad, right? And how, what does it, not only in terms of identity, like what does it mean to be a Black person in these different contexts, but also in terms of how, what ways can we tackle systemic racism and think about social justice in these different, you know, what kind of new tools or perspectives can we get to think about how to deal with these very insidious narratives of, you know, racism being over while still having, you know, mounds and mounds of evidence that it is not, right? So I think that I'm really optimistic about Black studies and Latinx studies, not only their just generally their interventions and their importance in academia and in social justice movements, but also for Afro-Latinx studies to really be very impactful in both of these fields, and also to help bring these fields together that are often kind of pitted against each other by like neoliberal university
Yes,
stuff.
indeed. So
Yeah.
I got a shameless plug on October 25th, our next webinar for Latinx Heritage Month will be with Vanessa Valdez
Yes.
talking about Arturo Schomburg. And Arturo Schomburg was my fraternity brother, Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. So, you know, I had a hidden agenda there slightly.
No, you're in very good
But that's
company.
what you just expressed is one of the reasons why, because I was hired to be the founding director of what they then framed as an African American Studies minor, but I chose to name it Global Black Studies to include all of the Americas and African descendants in Asia, in Europe, on the continent, and other places throughout the world, in part to, you know, try to overcome those obstacles. Because I remember when I was in graduate school at Michigan State University, and I did a dual PhD, one in history and the other was framed African American and African studies. And I was like, man, you know, that's leaving something out. And, you know, I theorized in my mind, well, maybe they mean African descendants in the Americas. And the reason why I felt, but that isn't what they meant, but the reason why I felt that, because, you know, I had people that I went to graduate school with that were studying, you know, African Pueblo, still Black Pueblos in southern Mexico.
Yeah.
You know, of course, people studying in Brazil, studying the Black experience in Brazil, but also studying the Black experience in Costa Rica or in Panama. So it was beyond just, you know, simply Cuba, because for the radical tradition and decolonization and the Black Power movement, you know, Cuba is something that people are more readily interested in studying. And then I had a friend in grad school, and he was studying Puerto Ricans in Chicago. And I was like, yes, see, this is what I imagine this whole enterprise should be. So I'm glad to hear you say the things that you said. Now, how was your work received? This particular book.
You know, that's a really good
I know
question.
that's probably a tough question because you're like, oh, everyone loved it.
No, but you know, what's really interesting, I think there's a couple of things here that make this complicated, actually. And some has to do with my positionality, right? Particularly as a Puerto Rican person who grew up in the United States. So one of the main kind of in sort of Puerto Rican elite circles, when people start bringing up questions of race, a lot of the conversation is, well, you grew up in the US and you have a hang up that we don't have here, right? So
Mhm.
that's one thing. Um, and the other thing being that I was working on a type of music that, even though my book came out in 2015, but when I was like, and even though when I was like in grad school and doing research for my book, like, reggaeton right now is like one of the most lucrative genres in the world, but that's not new, right? In the mid 2000s, late 2000s, that was true. And it was also crossing over. I mean, people forget about this, but there were English, Spanish remixes of pop songs at that time, just like we might have Justin Bieber doing them now, right?
Yeah.
Um, Paris Hilton even did a reggaeton remix of her song Stars Are Blind. And it was produced by Looney Tunes, who produced Gasolina and sort of all of the kind of classic 2000s hits of reggaeton. And it featured Wisin y Yandel. And for those of you who are big reggaeton fans, again, like a pioneering duo. We're talking about Paris Hilton. She made a reggaeton song. You can find it on YouTube. I love to play it for my students because it's really shocking. Um, that she did that. But that, I just mentioned that to say, like, it was very popular. Nevertheless, it remained very stigmatized, and I think for people who are not as familiar with the context, we can think about it very similar to hip hop, right? Which, hip hop may be mainstreamed in the US, but it still carries with it all of these assumptions about working class Black urban communities, right?
Mhm.
So there's that, right? Like, and even now, I sometimes will meet a colleague who will be like, wow, I can't believe you study this gross stuff. Because the other aspect of it is, you know, reggaeton, a lot of reggaeton deserves the critique for being misogynistic, right? Or, a lot of reggaeton songs were very, violent, right? And that is a problem that that genre has had. And even now, it may be softened, like the romantic stuff, but it's still pretty misogynistic genre, right? And so that it merits that critique. But yeah, I think the other thing that I never expected when I was a grad student is, like, as a young woman, there were a lot of assumptions about me, like doing this research in this like hyper masculine, nasty environment, right? So there was that. So my I think in a lot of spaces, though, people are very hungry for analyses about these popular music trends. And in general, I mentioned before, the scholarship about reggaeton has been minimal. So there's a very, very important scholar named Raquel Rivera. She's not related to me at all, but she wrote it. Some people might know Raquel's work. She wrote a very famous book called New York Ricans in the Hip Hop Zone, about the Puerto Rican contributions to hip hop in New York. But she also did a huge amount of research and work about early reggaeton. At that time was called underground. She published interviews with artists. She did analyses of censorship campaigns, and she published things in Spanish and in English. Um, so she was profoundly important. And then there's an anthology called Reggaeton that has chapters about different, you know, chapters about Miami, chapters about, Cuba, but then also has chapters on gender. This is an anthology. So my book is the only monograph about it, which I think is very sad. Um, that we have this like huge genre of music, super popular all over the world, and I continue to have difficulty if I teach a class finding stuff for my syllabus because it's still ignored. And I think by academics. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that it continues to carry with it this reputation. But I also think that my students um, are sort of like the next, are the younger people, like they're not as hung up on this stuff, right? Like I have a class, I have nobody born before 2000 in this class. They don't, Gasolina came out when they were babies and they think, reggaeton has been sort of like mainstreamed forever.
Yeah.
And so I think there's increasing amounts of work being done. So I think that my book was generally well received. But I did get some pushback from people based on like, is this worth studying? Which from my perspective, my interpretation of that critique was it was one really about class and race. Like, should we study urban working class cultural formations? Like, why would we do that? That's not high culture, right?
Yeah.
And other critiques about race, studying race at all. You know, there is actually a book review that's not many, I don't think it's been like widely read, of my book, where the person says, you know, she's looking for racism where it doesn't exist because Puerto Ricans say there's no racism, right? So I think that there are places where a lot of these ideologies that I'm sort of hoping to write against
Mm-hmm.
are they're strong and they're deeply rooted, and those people aren't so excited about my book.
Yeah.
um, but I also think some of that stuff is shifting because although, as I said, there was mainstreaming of reggaeton in the mid 2000s, right? You know, since 2016 and Despacito, we have this whole other kind of thing going on that's way, like Nicky Jam said last week when he got his award, way bigger than I think what anyone would have expected 20 years ago, and certainly 30 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another. It's amazing to see how much this genre has blown up, and it'll be really interesting to see how academics respond if it suddenly becomes a more sort of legitimate object of study, right?
Indeed. Now, do you think that there are reggaeton artists that have been mislabeled under other genres? I say that I'll give some examples. I discovered reggaeton because I was a big Pitbull artist. And most people don't remember Pitbull started out as a gangster rapper in Miami. They know him now as Mr. Worldwide, as he calls himself, right? That's the Pitbull that they know. But I watched him evolve into that. But I think of artists maybe like Rihanna and other artists that because I listened to some reggaeton, I'm like, man, that song or those couple songs she did is more of that genre than of. And do you think some artists are being mislabeled?
I don't know because, well, so like if we think, I think one of the things, like if you hear commonalities, right, between someone like Rihanna and, a reggaeton singer, reggaeton is Caribbean music. And I think that this is another part of its racial politics, actually, right? You
Mm,
know, we certainly wouldn't have reggaeton if we didn't have Jamaican dance hall, right?
mm,
And sonically, they're very similar in some ways. Um, I also worked in graduate school. I worked with an ethnomusicologist who studied soca in Trinidad, and sometimes I would make her like mixtapes and of reggaeton songs because she was interested, and she would be like, "Man, I feel like some of these songs, like really, they just sound like soca songs to me, right?" And I think the Caribbeanness of reggaeton as something that's not just part of the Spanish speaking world, but rather the African diasporic world, right,
yeah.
gets lost in part because of the ways that we have labeled musical genres in the music industry, right? So the Latin music industry is imagined to be a place for Spanish speaking audiences, right? And in that definition, you might listen to something like Banda from Sinaloa and Mexico, which is a large band, that has clarinets and it has trumpets and it's informed by polka, right? And it doesn't sound anything like reggaeton, right? But
Yeah.
they get grouped together because the grouping is about language, right?
Yeah.
And I think that contributes somewhat to this whitening thing, because the Caribbean aspect of it, like sort of like dance hall, right, in the Latin music industry, I'm sorry, in the music industry is racialized as some foreign thing that's more like hip hop. And hip hop is a Black people thing, right?
Mhm.
And so if artists are getting mislabeled, I'm not sure, right? But I do think since I've written this book, I've written a few articles about race within the Latin music industry as a whole, because one of my frustrations has been an unwillingness, or what I perceive to be an unwillingness to think about how the Latin music industry also reproduces racism, right? Just because it's in Spanish doesn't mean that it's somehow a more progressive space. Let's say that the Latin Grammys are somehow more progressive than the regular Grammys, right?
Yes.
It's plagued with the same questions around class and race, and just within a sort of Latin American Latinx context. And so um, I become really interested in the ways that these categories become defined and then sold to people. And then it influences how we perceive an artist, right? If you are being exposed to someone for the first time and someone tells you this is what reggaeton is, you probably think, yeah, okay, right? Um, so I think that there's a lot of I also think in terms of artists being mislabeled, right? Then I think about something like Despacito, right? And so I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Despacito, right? Because it was the third predominantly Spanish language song to ever be #1 in the United States, right? Despacito. The person, and the version that becomes famous is the version with Justin Bieber, right? But the song is by Luis Fonsi and Daddy Yankee. So I mentioned Daddy Yankee's like a pioneer of reggaeton.
Mhm.
Luis Fonsi is another person who's had a long career, right? Like Daddy Yankee, like Enrique Iglesias, like all these people, like he's in his 40s, right? He's not a spring chicken. He's not new to the music industry. Um, and if you look at his old work, it's all kind of pop rock ballads,
Mhm.
right? In the mid 2000s, when reggaeton was very popular, he was not singing that. He was singing these very dramatic Latin pop ballads, right? And suddenly, when Despacito became popular in the United States, he got labeled by sort of like um, American media as a reggaeton singer. But he's not a reggaeton singer at all, right? And in fact, if you look at, um, and I don't think that Luis Fonsi has ever actually claimed to be a reggaeton singer, right? But if you look at interviews that he gave, or I wrote a paper about this with one of my students named Jericho Leshnik Torres. And so we looked at interviews with Luis Fonsi, also with Erica Ender, who was his co-writer, and a couple of the producers whose names escape me right now. But part of it was like he hadn't had a hit in a while, and they were looking at what was trendy, and they were like, and he had this song, and it was going to be like a cumbia style song, and they were like, you know what? This like reggaeton pop blend is super big right now, so let's add this to it, right?
Mhm.
I would consider him to be someone who has been mislabeled as a reggaeton singer, right? I
Mhm.
don't think it's a problem for someone to borrow different musical styles or be influenced by music that they weren't originally doing or that doesn't come from their group, right? We wouldn't have a lot of popular music that I like if people hadn't been sharing and borrowing things. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is when we look at someone like Luis Fonsi as a reggaeton singer, this sort of clean cut balladeer guy, um, a lot of other people get left out who have been doing this genre for a long time and who maybe are not perceived as so clean cut, meaning they're working class, they um, are tacky, right, which is like a racialized term, right?
Indeed.
They're black, right? And so I think I find that kind of mislabeling I would call it mislabeling, to be really problematic, but also not surprising at all and very typical of the Latin music industry. Another example I always like to use in my classes that probably people here are familiar with is Desi Arnaz and I Love Lucy, right? So
Yes.
Desi Arnaz, he's a elite white Cuban guy, and he comes to the United States and he becomes popular singing kind of what some critics would have called like a watered down version of mambo, which is an Afro-Cuban musical style.
Mm.
And you have these great Afro-Cuban artists like Machito y sus Afro-Cubanos, this band that's run by two Black Cuban singers in New York, right? Or Arsenio Rodriguez, who's another Black Cuban immigrant who comes to the Bronx. But the image that people have of sort of like mambo and like, you know, this kind of time period of like cool Latin music is Desi Arnaz, right? So it's the same kind of thing, right? And I think it was really important for us to pay attention to those patterns. Um, so I think it's important for us to remember that reggaeton is Caribbean music. Like it just is, you know.
Yes,
Um,
ma'am.
yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Well, that was a wonderful answer. It got to what I was trying to scratch at with my question. Awesome. And I hope my students who are joining us from our history of hip hop class paid attention to how you and your student use interviews, because we've been watching a lot of interviews as well as videos uh, as primary sources to
Yeah.
identify moments in time in
Mhm.
American history as well as the development of hip hop itself, using hip hop in many ways as a metaphor to examine. So I hope they listen. And so, because I'm sure sometimes they think, I don't know if Dr. Watt knows what he's doing. Why isn't he lecturing more and we're watching these interviews? Because I'm giving them primary sources for their research paper as well as their response papers. So,
Indeed. Indeed.
yes, yes, yes. Now, in regards to how uh, elites view working class people, urban people, and then by definition or by default, reggaeton. Uh, how is race uh, used in regards to uh, upper mobility or socioeconomic status? Because I know it's not the same everywhere, and your research is primarily in Puerto Rico. But I know, like in Brazil, someone could be uh, what we would call in America a dark skinned person, but if they're wealthy, they're considered white. And if someone is looks like Marshall Mathers, but if they're poor, in some instances they may be considered black because of their social economic status.
Yeah.
Is that Do we see that playing into?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's a sort of like money whitens phrase when people think about like as you move up in class, socioeconomic class,
Hmm.
um, you become closer to whiteness, right? I think there's a couple of things like you know, I'm not sure how exactly like objectively true that is, but yes, that is sort of the ideology, right? And certainly like when you look at reggaeton singers of the past, right? Some of these pioneers, like I keep mentioning Daddy Yankee, right? Daddy Yankee's identifies as a mixed race person, right? He has a black father and a white mother.
Hmm.
Um, but he's a pretty white looking guy, right? And so, you know, I think yes, like when I say that reggaeton emerges in these like working class urban communities that are predominantly black, there were non-black people involved in that. I also think it's important to note that racial categories are different in different places.
Yes, ma'am.
So in the US, we've had this one drop rule, this like very strict obsession with the purity of whiteness, right? And as a result, expansive notion of what blackness is, right? Um, in order to say that whiteness is purely white and there's nothing else in there, right?
Yeah.
In Latin America, I used to have this professor in graduate school who would put this in perhaps maybe a kind of like simplistic or crude way, but I think it's very effective. He would say Latin America is the opposite one drop rule. One drop of whiteness makes you white. What he meant by that is, whereas in the United States, we're like obsessed about white purity, in Latin America, whiteness is compatible with race mixture. You can be a racially mixed person and still be considered white in much of Latin America. Because whereas we in the US think about race in terms of ancestry, right? So the one drop of Black blood, you know, you have a Black grandmother, and that kind of makes you Black even if you don't look like a Black person, right? In Latin America, it's much more about phenotype, about how you look, right? So, and that makes sense because if you think about this being a region where everyone is assumed to be racially mixed, right? Then everyone's the same. So then what's different? The difference is how you look. So there are scholars who talk about, for example, the socialization of youth in families and how they're racialized differently. So you could have a family in Latin America where the kids are racialized differently depending on how they look, right? Considered different racial categories. So I think race is quite complicated. And I think some people have criticized me, and I think it's a valid critique, for saying these like predominantly Black communities. And I think what I like to convey there is really communities that are understood to be sort of non-white, right? Because Puerto Rico has a substantial set of racial categories that do not exist in the US, right? That, you know, we have categories that delineate different phenotypic combinations around hair texture or facial features like the nose or something like that, that in the United States, that would just be Black people, right?
Yes.
And so I think, but certainly these are multiracial spaces. And I do think that socioeconomic class plays a role in how people understand race and racialization in Puerto Rico for sure. But it is one of the real tricky things, like when you're thinking about a global Black studies program, I think not just Latin America, but in general, a lot of times our racial translations don't translate neatly. Exactly. And that can make it really hard to figure out how to like convey what you're trying to say about racial politics in a place, right? I think all of us, that was a conversation when I was in graduate school where I had, you know, classmates who were studying Costa Rica and, you know, someone studying China, someone going to the South Pacific, someone going to Sweden. Like, how can we talk to each other in a common language while respecting these sort of like local differences of how Blackness is understood? And so I think it's tricky, but yes, I do think for the, you know, it's phenotype and socioeconomic class like sort of impact this kind of spectrum of racial identities in Latin America in a way that I'm not sure happens here. Yeah.
Indeed. That reminds me, when I was teaching at University of North Carolina at Pembroke, I had a student who was also my frat brother. His name was David Hernandez, and he was a fair-skinned Puerto Rican kid. And I remember someone was asking, why did he join a Black fraternity? And he said, well, I'm Black. And they was like, no, you're not, you're white. And he was like, no, I'm Puerto Rican. They said, yeah, but you're white. And he said, look at my nose. And that contextualizes it a lot. And I remember I got banned from some Instagram account because he went viral for doing our fraternity dance. And everyone kept saying, and I was very frustrated because some of the administrators were members of our fraternity. So, and they were allowing people to disrespect them because they were misidentifying his ethnicity. And I kept saying like, no, you know, this is our brother. It don't matter if he's Black or white, because we got Black, white, Asian, whatever in our fraternity. But I was like, you know, but this is our brother and he's a Black man. And y'all are letting these people call him a white man. And I know him personally. He's my mentee, my former student. I mean, that personally hurts him. And I've met his family when he graduated. I met his dad, and I was like, yeah, I tell Dave all the time he's black. And he laughs and he says, I tell him too, look at his nose. And, and then we all laugh. But, it's that complexity, that the oversimplification, and you said it eloquently with the one drop rule, and then the perception of skin tone
Mm-hmm.
and defining, race, and even trying to define more specifically blackness.
Yeah. And I want to say that I think that is important, right? Like if we're thinking about a US context,
Yeah.
right? So I'm someone who has African ancestry, but I certainly don't live the same experience of someone who is very unambiguously Black woman walking around in the world, right? I
Yeah.
don't face the same anti-Black racism as someone who has who people identify as unambiguously Black,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think the challenge we have, particularly in Afro-Latinx studies, is to think about how do we make space for these complexities, but also recognize that there is anti-Black racism, and the bodily experience of being Black is very particular, right?
Yeah.
And I have a really great colleague named Omari Zamora. She's a Black Dominican scholar at Rutgers. And she wrote a really good piece in this journal called Small Acts, which is a Caribbean studies journal, about terminology, right? And the importance of, when we say Afro-Latinx, it doesn't become a thing where everybody, because all Latinos have Black ancestry, we're all Afro-Latinx, and we pay attention to the very real experiences and material realities of Latinx people who are unambiguously Black. And I think that's a tension we have in our field, and both things need to exist simultaneously, right? We have to look at both things. So I think, like, it is very confusing for people. And I also think region matters a whole lot. Like, I grew up primarily in the Northeast, right? In Connecticut, where there's a substantial Puerto Rican population, right? And where everybody from Connecticut sort of, there's a connection to New York City, even though we're not really in New York City. But even in Boston, like, Boston being the town we're equidistant, right, in the central Connecticut from the two. And both of those cities have substantial Afro-Latino populations, right, where historically Puerto Ricans and then Dominicans are the primary Latinx groups, and they have strong ties to the African diaspora, and many people look Black. And so it wasn't a strange thing for, when I was growing up, to have Puerto Ricans who look like me hang around in these Black spaces, right? Because Puerto Ricans were racialized as distinct from Black people, but sharing a lot of things.
Yes, ma'am.
When I moved to California, that was like a totally different universe, where Latinidad and Latinx identity, which is dominated by Mexican American and maybe sometimes Central American, was understood to be fundamentally distinct from Blackness, even though we know there are historically Afro-Mexican, Afro-Central American communities, including in California, right?
Yeah.
But that was, and suddenly the experience of being a Latinx person, in a non-Black Latinx person in Black spaces, was considered weird by other Latinx people and by some other Black people. I think in my particular graduate program, because we were very like African diaspora, globally minded people, it wasn't that weird. But, in other spaces, there was skepticism, which I understand. But I also think, I think region also plays a role with this confusion, right? Because there are some locations where there might be a little confusion, but it might not be as weird as other places, right? And I think that's, we really have to be nuanced. Like, when, something I always want to convey to my students is, it's really important to be specific and to be nuanced, and to not be afraid that things are contradictory because most of our life is a giant contradiction, right? So, your research and your work is much more, I think, much stronger if you can acknowledge that these contradictions exist, as opposed to saying, like, nope, it's this or that, the end, right? I think that can be very hard and very frustrating, and it's something I think all of us struggle with, like, as we're moving through the world. But I think it's an important thing for us to think about, and to think about, like, you can say there are these diverse kind of Latinx experiences and different conceptions of Blackness, and you can say, a dark-skinned Black woman who's Dominican has a different life than non-Black Latinx people, right? Both things can be true.
Indeed, and I hope my students are listening, because we're just we're just wrapping up the golden era, and we've been talking about militant Black and Afrocentric hip hop themes. And, we've identified, no matter how progressive it is, we've identified like misogyny in some of the lyrics, the imagery. I mean, that contradiction, it may be uncomfortable, but it leads to deeper understanding, deeper intellectual discourse, and more, I would say, more rooted or grounded research, because it's the human experience, and the human experience is extremely contradictory, and it may even help people further understand the discussion we just had of, why we gave, I don't consider it a pass, but why we gave Fat Joe, a Colombian American, and Jennifer Lopez, a Puerto Rican from the Bronx, right, the pass on saying the N-word. And then the next generation behind us, they were freaking out when they, I guess, went back in time and discovered their music. And they were freaking out. And I'm like, why are you guys freaking out? Y'all don't freak out when I say it. You don't freak out when Tupac said it. And they were like, oh, they're not Black. I'm like, oh, they're part of the diaspora. They, so it's very, very important for people to think about it in those terms, and see the contradictions, within it. I mean, that's, when you study the human condition, contradictions you're going to find abound, right?
Yeah. And I think when you study racism, right? So my father, who's not an academic, but he moved in the 70s in a lot of sort of like radical political spaces. He used to tell me, like, racism doesn't make sense. Like, it's a very impactful thing in life, and it has very serious consequences. But like, if you encounter racism, or you're thinking about how race operates in society, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. You're right. It doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't mean that it's not something that impacts people's lives, because it is. But what it means is, like, there isn't, one of the things that's so tricky about studying race and racism is that the logic is constantly shifting, right? And so one thing can be true 5 years ago that's totally not true now. And like, so I think it's the human condition, but I think it's particularly acute when you study these kinds of topics, right? Because you want to pay attention to the ways it impacts people's lives, but also it can be confusing, and also be like, that makes no sense. And it's a lot of my students, I just had a student today in my office hours, like, this doesn't make any sense. Is this what this person is saying? And I'm like, yeah, that is what they're saying. You understand what they're saying, actually.
But it's illogical. That's what I tell my students. I say racism and the racial project, to use Charles Mills' terminology, is illogical.
Right.
So don't, you're trying to look for consistency or the logic in the illogicalness to see patterns and structures and all that. But I'm like, y'all got to remember, it's illogical. Yes, Thomas Jefferson was a racist, but he loved Black women. Like, yes, it's illogical, I know, but
Exactly.
You know, it's the thing. So, to the audience listening, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A that should be at the bottom of your screen. I certainly encourage students to ask questions as we begin to wind down our conversation, and that's why, you know, I scheduled it for 2 hours for that opportunity. But I encourage everyone to ask questions, but particularly the students. So please, students, drop a question in the Q&A. But so do you think while we're hoping and waiting for someone to ask a question, uh, do you think that reggaeton, just like hip hop in many ways, will become the new standard of what is pop music? Because right now, when people say pop, like country western music, right now, pop country western is, it's a lot of hip hopishness going
Yeah.
on. Right. I'll put it that way. And do you see that type of thing happening on a global scale with reggaeton?
Yeah, I think it's already happening. I think
Mhm.
Latin pop music, Spanish language pop music is
Yeah,
very reggaeton
indeed.
heavy, right?
Yeah.
Um, and this is exactly when we were looking up the Despacito interview. That's exactly what those producers were saying. They were like, everybody wants to listen to this. You better stick this beat in your song. Um, and some people, I don't know, may remember, like we have these Latin music stalwarts like Ricky Martin and Enrique Iglesias, very popular in Spanish. They cross over to the United States in English. That's how a lot of people know them in the late 90s, early 2000s. Then they're, back to being in Spanish. Um, and they all have reggaeton songs, right? So I believe that it is the sound of current Latin pop music.
Mhm.
Um, Even though a lot of people are like, no, it's not. It's, pop is pop. But I don't know if anybody, so this is perhaps taking a turn you don't expect, but I also have, an 8-year-old. So we watched the Trolls World Tour movie. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet.
So the
I'm sure I
trolls
will
are
soon.
like the pop trolls, right? And they
Yeah.
sing pop music. And then they discover there's a whole world out there of other musical genres. And there's like a set of trolls who sing country, a set of trolls who sing like heavy metal. And then there are these funk trolls. And when they go to the funk trolls, one of the funk trolls is voiced by Anderson Paak. And then there's a bunch of popular artists in there. The funk trolls are like, your pop stuff wouldn't exist without our funk trolls. And then the pop trolls are all like verklempt and upset because they realize that they took music from the funk trolls without giving them credit. And, I am a parent who's really not in, I don't enjoy watching cartoon movies. I hate them. But I was like, this movie is so important, guys. And I think my children were like, oh my God, like they don't like the Trolls movie. And I'm like, that's the only one I want to see again. But it's the same thing happens in Latin music, right? Like
Yes, it did.
reggaeton is, a lot of Latin pop stalwarts are like, nope, nope, nope. But if you listen to the Latin pops, well, I guess there's no stations anymore, Latin pop playlist or whatever, that's what you hear. Um,
And
yeah.
I had that experience with Zombies 1, 2, and 3 with my daughter, and I'm all excited because I'm like, no, they talking about racial differences and and all these conflicts and having to share this space, and she's like, no, Dad, it's about zombies, humans, werewolves, and aliens. And I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, I guess I did get too heavy for you, baby. I guess it is. All
It's
right,
hard not to be a killjoy, right?
I know. So we have a couple questions
I
in the
see.
Q&A. The first question is, how do you think the understanding of race politics in reggaeton impacts Puerto Ricans' identity development in the diaspora?
That's a very good question. And there's um, a lot of literature about the racialization of Puerto Ricans in diaspora, and particularly in New York City, right? Because until relatively recently, New York was the main place where Puerto Ricans, these big waves of Puerto Rican migration in the 50s, right? They're all going to New York. Now, most Puerto Ricans are going to Florida, and actually a lot in the Orlando area. So there's a lot of literature about New York Puerto Ricans, sometimes called New Yorkers, right? These are like the big puns, right? So the Raquel Rivera book about Puerto Ricans and hip hop is also a lot about like racialization of Puerto Ricans, right? Juan Flores, these. Um, so one of the things that I think is really important, and I see there's a question about the influence of hip hop too. Um, I think one of the things that's important is that so the racialization of Puerto Ricans in New York, right? A lot of these scholars argue, and I talk a little bit about it in my book too at the end, that a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York were understood to be non-Black, like not like Black Americans, but very similar culturally to Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And also were understood to have many of the same stereotypes placed on them as Black Americans had. And an example I like to use is, the culture of poverty, which is this terrible theory by this anthropologist named Oscar Lewis. And he uses this research he does on this Puerto Rican family in San Juan and then in New York to say that poor people are poor because they have a cultural tendency to be like sort of lazy poor people, right? And doesn't talk about any structural anything, right?
Okay.
That's about Puerto Ricans, right? But then you also have like Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan report at the same
Yeah.
time saying urban African American communities have these pathologies, tangle of pathologies, right? Because they're poor, and it's all about having a single Black mom and not being, and again, no structural problems, right? I don't
Right.
think it's an accident that those theories kind of develop around the same time about Puerto Ricans and African Americans simultaneously, right?
Yeah.
So all of this is to say that the Puerto Rican diaspora has a history of being very racialized in the United States, particularly in New York, which, like I said, is but for a long time and by a lot. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. The largest community in the U.S. Um, understood to be akin to Blackness in a way, right?
Yeah.
And in Puerto Rico, that's also true, right? So if you think about who migrates to a place, it's usually people from working class, laborers, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
usually not elites who are like living their best life in this place who suddenly decide to migrate out of necessity, right?
Indeed.
And so they're already, when they come back to Puerto Rico, there are some scholars who have also done interviews and oral histories with Puerto Ricans in the diaspora who move back. And they also get racialized as sort of akin to Blackness in Puerto Rico too, as sort of inauthentically Puerto Rican. And what is inauthentic about them is their attachment to Black culture, like hip hop, right?
Mhm.
And in fact, one of the things that I find fascinating about the initial sort of um, criticism of early reggaeton in the mid 1990s that was coming from the left in Puerto Rico, right, from progressive people, is that reggaeton is copying hip hop and it's like a form of cultural imperialism, which is just crazy to think about, right? Like that this is when we know like what the history of hip hop is and all of that stuff. So that, in the book I talk about, and I found in my research, like editorials about this, right?
Mhm.
And that the problem of reggaeton is, yes, misogyny and stuff, but also that this is this import coming into the United States trying to get us to talk about Blackness, right? So it
Mhm.
was really amazing to me. But so there's this long history. Now, in the current moment, that's a really interesting question that I haven't thought a lot about, to be honest. Um, I think another really interesting thing to think about with the racialization of Puerto Ricans that makes them unique vis-a-vis other Latinx groups is that Puerto Rico remains a colony of the US, right? And it's been a colony of the United States, like I said, since 1898.
Mhm.
And something that a really interesting project is to look at the discourses about race that the United States produced about Puerto Ricans at various key moments, right? So 1898, there's all these very famous political cartoons of a very tall, skinny Uncle Sam and these 4 Black children around him that he's coaching, and they represent Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam. Those are the 3 territories that come from the Spanish-American War, and Hawaii, which is annexed around the same time, but not through the Spanish-American War because the United States overthrows the Hawaiian monarchy, which we can't get into today, but right? So and it's this very colonial imagery of these young, literally Black children who need guidance to become modern and civilized, right? Then, right, we move along, blah, 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 blah. I mentioned 1917, Puerto Ricans are granted US citizenship, right? So Congress passes a law that says no matter where you're born, even if you're born on the island of Puerto Rico, you will be considered a US citizen. In the times leading up to that, Puerto Ricans become a lot whiter in the literature. And that's not an accident, right? Because 1917, we're still in this, we're in this phase where we're really restricting citizenship to white people, right? And so if you're going to give this island of people that 15 years ago, you were portraying as Black citizenship, then you have to make them look whiter so that they can be citizens, right? Then I'm oversimplifying things. If you fast forward to these huge waves of migration in the 1950s and representations of things like West Side Story, right? And then suddenly Puerto Ricans are again racialized as sort of not Black, but sort of like Black people and violent and terrible kind of excluded populations, right? So it's really interesting to see how Puerto Rican racialization changes over time. And I think right now we're in a very interesting moment because Puerto Rico, many of you probably know, right, that Puerto Rico got hit by Hurricane Fiona, literally almost 5 years to the day that it was hit by Hurricane Maria, right? And before Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico had this massive debt crisis that has kind of led to these very extreme austerity measures and cuts to social services and things. All of this has propelled one of the biggest migrations of Puerto Ricans to the United States. And as I said, many of them are going to Florida, right? And so it's going to be interesting to see how Puerto Ricans are understood, in the future. Because if you think about, I was just showing my class this yesterday, we were talking about Hurricane Maria. And I don't know if anybody remembers when Donald Trump goes to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and he throws the paper towels at the people. But he says things like, basically so Puerto Rico is in debt, right? And Puerto Rico can't declare bankruptcy like a place like Detroit because it's not a state. It's a colony. So there are legal structures that prevent Puerto Rico from being able to declare bankruptcy. And this is the problem, right? And he says, basically, you people don't know what you're doing. You've squandered this money. And he draws on all of these stereotypes that were being used in the 1950s of the culture of poverty and the idea that like Puerto Ricans are sort of sapping everything from the state and not contributing anything, that kind of welfare stereotype, right? Yes. So it's interesting. I'm interested to see how in this massive moment of migration, in this complex politics that we have right now, where we have, with the Trump administration, for example, like anti-immigrant sentiment that's always been there, but being ramped up, right? Yes. But then you have these Puerto Ricans who are like Spanish-speaking US citizens, and they don't really, they're not the same as the people who are on the border, like, because they are US citizens, but then they're also sort of like undesirable in these other ways. It's going to be really interesting to see. And I also think the ascendancy of a person like Bad Bunny is interesting because he is so unapologetically Puerto Rican. He talks about it all the time. Those of you who study Spanish or speak Spanish know that Spanish is really different depending on where you are, right? And Puerto Rican Spanish is a type of Spanish that within the Spanish speaking world has been very stigmatized for being too slangy, having an accent that is actually like a very Afro-Caribbean accent, for having too much English kind of integrated into the Spanish. And he sort of like, he uses all these Puerto Rican colloquialisms, like he doesn't care. He's just like, this is what it is. And he has drawn attention to a lot of these issues, particularly after, after Hurricane Fiona, but he just released a video called El Apagón, which is a song about blackouts in Puerto Rico. But apagón means blackout, but the song is really about, kind of criticizing the current Puerto Rican government for like not taking care of its people, right? And in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. And then at the end of the music video is this 23-minute documentary about how these different laws that allow Americans to move to Puerto Rico and not pay taxes, and how that's contributed to the displacement of Puerto Ricans. So is that going to impact the racialization of Puerto Ricans? I'm not sure, but I do think that suddenly, like I've taught courses about Puerto Rico for a long time, suddenly I have students who know a little bit about this stuff who never knew it before. And I think one of the things he's done is really called attention to these issues. And it's just, I'm interested to see what happens. It's a great question though. Maybe you should research it. You should research it.
Yes, you can. I'm sorry. So what else? All right, give me a minute, baby. Someone else asked, was there anything in particular that sparked your interest in research in reggaeton or motivated you to write your book? I think maybe you might have answered that at the very beginning of our
Yeah.
Okay. And then another person asked, do you think that Latin American music had any influence on American culture? Without me doing any research, I'm sure the answer is a yes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think also that's an interesting question too, because so like there's so many ways one can approach this question, right? One could approach the question by thinking about crossovers on how, or an artist like Shakira, right? Who, Spanish speaking sort of rocker person in Colombia comes to US, right? So you could think about the impact of crossovers. You can think about the impact of US born and raised Latinos who don't necessarily perform what we consider Latin music, but have really influenced, right? And probably the most have influenced American pop with kind of Latin music sounds. And one example could be Santana, right? The guitars. Now, Santana is a little complicated, right? Because he's from Tijuana and he's Mexican, and some people say, well, he's like borrowing from this Afro-Cuban music, like, right? There's all these layers, but I think a lot of, you would be hard pressed to say that Santana hasn't made a critical impact in the development of rock in the US, right?
And I say we can go way back to jazz.
Yes, of course. Yes, jazz. And think about Dizzy Gillespie, right? Dizzy Gillespie was really invested in working with Afro-Cuban musicians because he thought Afro-Cuban musicians were bringing this kind of more, I don't know if I would say pure, but like this very strong African influence in their music. And he wanted to draw from that. And so anybody who was ever in jazz band in your life probably had to play some version of the song Manteca. I'm a terrible singer. I'm not going to sing it for you, but if you Google Manteca, and you probably heard it in like 5,000 commercials or whatever, right? That song is a collaboration of Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo, an Afro-Cuban percussionist. So there's these, certainly jazz, like I said, hip hop, right? I'm sure in your class you're talking about how like hip hop is like the 4 elements, right? It's not just rapping, but like a lot of the most important breakers or graffiti artists were Puerto Ricans, right? So I think that there's another example my dad always likes to talk about, but I don't know so much about it because it's not my favorite, is doo-wop, right? There are a bunch of Latinos in doo-wop music. So I think it's had a profound influence. And that Latinos have been part of the American pop music story.
Mm,
And sometimes we don't even like know it, right? Like
yeah,
we don't even think about it because of the ways we think about how these genres are racialized. And I think also because a lot of the Latinos in Latin music and just in the music industry, like people in general, tend to be very white looking people and people just sort of assume. But yes, so I think it's profoundly important. And
mm,
um, that's definitely, there actually was a book. So there was a museum exhibit called American Sabor that went around, and it has a book. Um, so I don't think the exhibit exists anymore. I don't know. But the book that accompanies it is this book that the purpose of the book is to show how Latin music has influenced American pop, right, and rock, and not
mm,
only by identifying Latinos who've performed, but also making sonic connections between, songs like Louie Louie and, mambo beats, right? So it's profoundly influential.
indeed,
And I
indeed,
think there's a lot we should be doing, a lot to do to like get people to recognize that.
indeed, indeed, indeed. Are
Mhm.
there any more questions, guys, before we wrap it up?
I did just want to, this question, Kaylee asked about hip hop having an influence, like absolutely, right?
Mhm,
Hip hop. I talked about how there would be no reggaeton without dancehall. There also would be no reggaeton without hip hop. And
mhm,
actually, if you look at interviews with um, reggaeton singers in like the mid 2000s, right?
mhm,
And they talk about who a lot of their musical influences are. You hear hip hop names like Biggie, KRS-One, Public Enemy, right? And so it has a profound influence in um, all different, in a bunch of different ways, right? Aesthetics, how people, and if you listen to early reggaeton, when I was talking about these DJs and all the MCs that come around them, so one of them is this guy named DJ Playero, like player with an O at the end, and you can find his stuff on Spotify. And if you listen to it, you're going to hear all kinds of 90s hip hop samples in there. So it is a profoundly important ingredient, if you will, in
mhm.
this mix, for sure.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
this discussion and sharing your knowledge with the community and with our students and to all of our viewers who may watch it later in its recorded version. I think the work that you do is that you did and continue to do is very, very important.
Thank you.
And keep up the good work. And I'm sure that Wesley is very privileged to have you there. And
Thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation. And when you all have Vanessa Valdez, I hope everybody will go because her stuff on Schomburg is just fantastic. So I
indeed,
think you're going to love her.
awesome.
Thank
And
you so much.
all right. And on behalf of Western Carolina University and Global Black Studies minor program, we say have a wonderful Latinx, Chicano, Hispanic Heritage Month, and we have to continue to promote the experiences and contributions of all peoples to our various societies. So everyone enjoy and have a wonderful evening.